pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
This is the Saline City Planning Commission meeting for Wednesday, July 26, 2023. Will the recording secretary please call the roll?
Young.
Here.
Carroll.
Here.
Fosdick.
Here.
Marl.
Here.
Gearbaugh.
Here.
Cole. Absent. Beardsley.
Here.
Heft. Here. Troika.
Here.
Also, staff present tonight are City Planner Auerbach, Community Development Director Harrington, and Recording Secretary Katnick. Would somebody like to make a motion to approve the agenda as distributed?
So moved, Madam Chair.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Is there a motion to approve the meeting minutes of June 28th as submitted? Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Public comment. Under the Open Meetings Act, any citizen may come forward at this time and make comments. The person is requested but not required to state their name and address for the record. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes per person.
Hi, Ben Goodman. I'm on the west side of town. I have concerns about the marijuana dispensary going next to the party store and the dance studio. My question and concern is, and I hope you guys ask the business this when you're asking questions tonight, is the businesses where marijuana dispensaries are going, adjoining other buildings, like the one over next to Dollar General. There's a large chance that odors are going to roll over into that building, and the Dollar General currently is having that right now. It's nauseating when you go in there. You can smell the marijuana in the Dollar General. Nothing's been done about it. I've talked to Dollar General. They've complained. And there's a lot of people that just won't go in there anymore. I'm not the only one that feels this way. I've talked to a lot of other people in the community. I've seen complaints about it on Facebook. I have a concern with that happening to the dance studio. That's an older building, and they talk big on putting these great filtration systems in there. But what happens when they bring the product in there right before they open, and then kids go into dance, and you have this nauseating odor of marijuana in the dance studio? It's not right for the other businesses. So I want to know what the practice is if we start smelling an odor at the dance studio when people are taking your kids there. How do we complain? How do we shut that business down until they can get a better filtration system in there so we will not smell the odors? Because I know you have to vote for this. I know everybody up here has to vote for it. But, there's still a lot of people that are at that dance studio and that live in that area that aren't okay with it. We have the school opening up in the fall. St. Andrew's Catholic School is opening up in the fall, so that's within 1,000 feet. There's kids going at the dance studios. It's just not a great location for that. And so we still have concerns, and we're not in agreement with it. People on the west side of town, we don't want another one there. So thank you.
Seeing no additional comments, we'll start public hearing number 23-19, application from Martin Stoneman of Compassionate Advisors, LLC, for a final site plan for an adult-use marijuana retailer, remodeling the existing 1,760 square foot suite within the structure to create a retail space at 813 West Michigan Avenue, Saline, Michigan, 48176, parcel number 18-18-01-325-016. In our Planning Commission packet, we had a memo dated June 20th, 2023 from Community Development Director Harrington, a report dated June 14th, 2023 from City Planner Auerbach, and a memo dated June 13th, 2023 from OHM Engineer Boss.
Thank you. So as you mentioned, it's 813 West Michigan Avenue, Suite 2, action item 2319 for a final site plan. The applicant is only pursuing the adult use special land use that they were granted, so this is technically a final site plan for their adult use submittal. So the location is on the south side of West Michigan Avenue, and it's on the corner of River Oaks Boulevard, which is the street that goes into Six Trails Apartments. It's across the street from Baker's Nook, just for some site guidance, and adjacent to the now BP gas station. It is zoned C3, which is our general business district. The request is a final site plan. And since we haven't done one of these in a while, the Planning Commission approves or denies a formalized site plan based on zoning requirements, general appearance, engineering reviews, and specific concept. If approved, the applicant must make changes based on the conditions the Planning Commission sets, as well as modification in the event of conflicts with state building code. If any proposed change after an approved plan is found to be material, the applicant will be required to request a site plan amendment from the Planning Commission and appear again before this body. The current property is currently home to the Village Party Store and Dan Saline studio. The specific suite that they're in is currently unoccupied. The suite is 1,760 square foot in a 9,360 square foot building. It was built in 1979. The council approved the special land uses for adult use and medical, but as I mentioned, the applicant is only pursuing adult use at this time. So here are the rendering of the elevations that they submitted on this property. Please note that the building sign on the existing north elevation that I highlighted in red and said "C. Collins" on signs, obviously there's going to be a comment about that in the sign section of this. But essentially they're just retrofitting the existing suite and the existing building. They're not proposing any structural modifications to the exterior of the site. So for final site plan requirements, the Planning Commission shall review the preliminary and final site plan and approve with or without conditions or deny the application based on the purposes, objectives, and requirements of the City of Saline ordinance and standard specifications, which include things like area, width, height, and setbacks, natural resources impacted, building location and general site arrangement, parking and loading, site access and circulation, safety paths, landscaping, lighting, signs, floor plan and elevation, and then engineering considerations such as stormwater, utilities, et cetera. So in the staff review between Planner Auerbach, Engineer Boss at OHM, and myself, the concerns that were addressed or concerns that were raised relate to parking and loading, that the applicant must clarify whether they intend to restore the asphalt in the southeast corner of the parking lot so the spaces in that area may be restriped. Same thing for site access and circulation. Consider designating the asphalt area and the northeast corner of the site between the access drive and the first parking space along the east line as a no parking zone. So what I have pictured here is that southeastern portion where you can see the property line has some grass that cuts over it. And specifically for the northeast portion, if you look at the site plan in your packets, the proposed distance is not wide enough necessarily to have parking on both sides as well as two-way traffic. So our suggestion would be to make it a no parking zone and then reconfigure the site around that. For signs, again, due to this elevation here, let's get back on mine, but not on yours. Due to the elevation there, we would just recommend that the applicant submit sign areas that comply with section 12.053. The general issue is that for building signs, regardless of whether the sign ordinance is changed, the specific provision remains unchanged in our proposal. You get 1 square foot of signage for 1 square foot, for 1 linear foot of tenant space for building signs. So only, in this case, about 22 square foot of signage would be allowed for building signs. So items for the Planning Commission's consideration. There continues to exist an issue with the proposed layout of the parking lot. The applicant will either need to restore the asphalt to make the southeastern side of the parking lot compliant with the code, or the Planning Commission will need to acknowledge the deficiency in parking. The northeast side of the parking lot is currently parked on despite the area not being long enough to accommodate parking. Although this area will not be restriped, it may be worth considering designating it as a no parking zone, either with striping or signage specifically. The applicant has a unique issue with signage. There's no way for them to sign their tenant space without using roof signage, which is actually technically prohibited in our signing code. But however, there's no other option due to how the roof drops there. Additionally, if the applicant was interested in landscaping and painting and signing the side of the building facing Michigan Avenue, it wouldn't be possible. It wouldn't be possible due to our building sign standards. And it's staff's opinion, though, that the painting and landscaping would be an aesthetic improvement. But as I mentioned, because of the sign standards, it couldn't work. A ground sign within our sign code could be considered. So they're allowed to have a building sign and a ground sign technically per our code. And in my report, I have 2 additional conditions that can be added based on your settlement of the parking and signage issues. And then lastly, a recommendation would be to move to approve the final site plan for Compassionate Advisors with the following 8 conditions. 1, the applicant is necessary and is responsible for and shall pull all necessary building, trade, state, or and/or county permits. 2, that the approval shall be valid for a period of 365 days. This is verbatim from our ordinance language. It's not a unique condition. 3, any items identified by the building department in the review shall be corrected prior to construction. 4, the applicant shall provide spot elevations at all 4 corners of the barrier-free parking spaces and along the existing sidewalk at 50-foot intervals to verify Americans with Disabilities Act compliance. If the barrier-free parking spaces in the sidewalk are not compliant, they will need to be removed and replaced. The applicant shall also identify the location of the ramp near the barrier-free parking spaces on the plans. 5, the applicant shall provide a stormwater narrative on the plans clarifying how the existing stormwater runoff and treatment is to be maintained, as well as its ultimate outlet. 6, the applicant shall provide the location, size, and material of all existing utilities, including fire hydrants, on the plan. 7, the applicant shall provide turning templates for the largest vehicles proposed to access the site to ensure sufficient space has been provided. And 8, the applicant shall provide a narrative, location map, parcel information, the applicant and designer's engineer's contact information, et cetera, on the plans, or provide a cover sheet with this information. These are all relatively standard things that are asked for by OHM. The back half, as you can probably identify, 4 through 8, and they're meant to begin prior to beginning of construction. However, we don't believe any of these things will be a hindrance in the ultimate site having material change as a result of a discovery found in any of those, in the process of following those 4 conditions. So with that, I will go back to the recommendations page, or consideration page, and kick it to you.
Great, thank you. Mr. Auerbach, do you have anything else to add?
I think Mr. Harrington covered it, but as a reminder to the commission, there were a number of conditions of approval with the preliminary site plan and special use for this project, many of which the applicants addressed. They provided a copy of the recorded agreement to utilize the parking spaces to the adjacent property to the south, as well as a certification of the number of spaces available on site. So the remaining items we mentioned in our review have to do with, relate back to 2 of the conditions of that original approval, which was that the existing parking lot nonconformities can't be increased, and that the applicant confirm the total number of spaces available on site. So in order for the plan to be consistent with both the surveyor's count of available parking spaces, the original site plan, and the conditions of approval, we cite those 2 outstanding items related to the lot, paving those spaces or somehow correcting them in the southeast, and also considering that striping to designate the no parking area adjacent to the entrance access drive, because the drive is wide, and as Mr. Harrington mentioned, can't accommodate or poses vehicle conflicts with parked cars and those entering the site.
Great, thank you. Any questions? Yes. Yes.
The applicant has made us aware that there's been a change in ownership of the proposed operating entity. What due diligence does that cause us to do to go back and re-review the application, or to better understand maybe the credentials of the new or the remaining owners?
So part of the licensing process, when they change ownership, they have to submit attestations for each of the new owners, and they essentially go through the same process as if they were new applicants. It doesn't start the process over because they've essentially acquired the LLC, but they are all background checked as part of that process.
And you've done that?
Yes, that has occurred.
Thank you.
Yes.
Mr. Harrington, can you address again the signage issue? Because we've already had considerable problems with the existing 2 facilities in terms of how they've done signage and everything. Is there a recommendation that we put some kind of condition in here to make sure that it complies? I don't want to see any exceptions to our current, our future.
So the signage condition would be that it complies with the standards established in our signage ordinance, which I think I added that as a condition in my memo specifically that could be added.
That's what I want to clarify. It's not part of the 8 that are currently listed. Correct?
No, but it is one of those ones that I say could be added depending on your settlement of the issue. I imagined it would be added, but I just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same
Yeah, I
signage
just want
page.
to make sure that's what you wanted to. As to curbside,
I believe that was a preliminary condition established with this, but I would just out of abundance of precaution, I don't see a harm in adding that as an additional condition to this, that no curbside pickup shall be conducted by this enterprise until the city has passed an ordinance.
okay. And that's it from me right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
I'd like to address the comment made by the citizen regarding odor. I know that in all the marijuana establishments, they're supposed to have air handling equipment to mitigate any marijuana odor, and Dollar General does have a real problem. So the question is, what kind of inspection does the building department do? How do they certify that the air handling is operating as intended?
Right, so I believe that actually falls under LARA and the Cannabis Regulatory Agency or Marijuana Regulatory Agency. So it's not something our building department is looking at specifically when issuing certificate of occupancies. However, the applicants have to submit us an odor control plan as part of their licensing application. I'm still unclear if it's a LARA issue if they're not in compliance with that, or if it's something that we would then have the ability to pull their license on. But it is something that city staff are actively investigating due to known complaints of other facilities.
What's going to happen?
I think the question of, the city could likely get more specific if you wanted to in terms of specific odor control requirements. I believe right now, just the licensing requirements, are that an applicant will provide odor control, their odor control system specifications, and it could also be addressed under the general annual license review, and there's, I believe, language in the code saying that any complaints need to be addressed and can be the basis for termination or non-renewal of a license. So at minimum, those the specifications for the equipment being used has to be provided, which I believe the applicants did during the preliminary site plan stage. They would have to do that again when they apply for a license, and it's something that the city would review on an annual basis. So if there were complaints, could be addressed. If not, just on in response to the complaint during that license renewal.
And I think the general direction of the city is to bring the issue up with the Cannabis Regulatory Agency, which more specifically regulates odor and for lack of a better word, the externalities associated with dispensaries, which kind of falls outside the scope of the building code specifically. So we're in a new phase of regulation where the state, the city have different codes essentially that we're operating on, which makes it a challenge to say the least.
Does the state certify the buildings and their odor?
The state
control?
provides them a license as well. But to my knowledge, the state does not provide them a stamp that says your building is odor-free, essentially, no.
So there's no check?
At this time, it sounds like the state is having a hard time enforcing that, yes.
Is the city prepared to look at this issue and inspect follow up on the complaints and inspect the air handling?
As I mentioned, that's something that we're already actively engaging in, and what is our enforcement capability, whether that be with the license itself, whether that be with citations, or whether that be reporting to LARA essentially about the issues that we're experiencing. So yes, we're already actively investigating which way this needs to be handled, if it needs to be a city ordinance, or if there is a mechanism through the state to resolve the issue, resolve the nuisance.
Yes.
Is there anything we can do in terms of addressing what they have already installed in terms of their air handling and odor abatement, and making sure that what happens here exceeds what's there, because we already know we have a problem in that building? Or is there no way to put that in as a condition? I'm trying to understand, how can we, in this...
I would have to consult legal counsel on that one specifically because it's a rather niche issue on it's a unique aspect to marijuana dispensaries, it seems. It's not a common issue that we have elsewhere in the city.
Well, we could put a condition in here that whatever is the final outcome must comply, and if there is an issue with odor, it needs to be addressed immediately.
Right, I would encourage you to add that condition, but like I said, I feel more comfortable consulting legal counsel on that one specifically.
Additional discussion? Yes.
One question, Madam Chair. Mr. Harrington and Mr. Arbach, your memos and presentations were quite clear and helpful. Thank you. Not a question specific to this project, but maybe for the record you can clarify, Mr. Harrington. In addition to the two existing adult cannabis retailers and Compassionate Advisors LLC, we do not have any additional applicants who have current site plans, and it's my understanding that several have dropped out of the process. Is that correct?
They've been dismissed from the process. They haven't dropped out. So
Excuse me.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the preliminary site plan lasts for 6 months. Compassionate Advisors was the only one out of our applicants who asked for a formal extension, which was granted. That's administrative for final site plans. It comes to you for the extension. So at this time, all other applicants besides the two that are currently open and the one before you have removed themselves from the process or have been removed from the process.
Very good. Thank you.
Additional discussion? Is there a motion on the table to acknowledge receipt of the memos from the Community Development Director Harrington, Planner Auerbach, and OHM Engineer Boss?
I'll move to acknowledge, Madam Chair.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Motion passes. We will allow 10 minutes for the applicant developer comments.
Evening, Commissioners. My name is Sam Kilberg. I represent the applicant in this, in my address, 39577 Woodward Avenue, Suite 300, Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. I'm counsel for the applicant, Pincana here. And I want to address the odor concern kind of up front. Just to let you know, this applicant, this will be their 4th retail spot here in Michigan. And based on construction timing, it will actually be our 6th by the time it opens. So not their first rodeo. I mean, they run a lot of these and don't have these sorts of problems of odor. And a big part of that is because this entity is a vertically integrated entity. So they grow, package, and sell their own marijuana at their stores. So when it comes into these retail sites, it's actually already prepackaged. So they're not getting raw flower that they're packaging and have the odor smells. So, if that's something you want to stipulate too, we are fine with that we will prepackage it. But as was stated, we want to be a good neighbor to our surrounding businesses. We don't want the smell as well. It's just, it's a bad look, it's bad for business, and that's not the kind of facilities that we run. So, we hear you and we hear the concerns of the citizens and want you to know that we do take that very serious. As for the site plan, as to why we're here today, Ben mentioned, the application meets all the requirements for site plan approval here today. And so we've worked with staff and we've reviewed the memos and reports of OHM, and we are fine with all of the conditions being approved. It meets all of the requirements. I want to address some of the items here. As far as the asphalt in the southeast corner, we are aware of that. The applicant, if you remember from the time of site plan, special land use approval, we will be repaving and restriping the entire parking lot. So we will be addressing those concerns, as well as we noted the parking on the entrance coming off in the northwest. That will be a no parking zone. I think we've discussed that. It just seems unsafe the way that the layout currently is. There's actually a parking space right up against the road, so we're fine with that as well as a condition. As for signage, I know I spoke to Ben earlier this week. We understand the ordinance compliance is 22 feet for that location. We have no problem resubmitting elevation showing a sign with 22 feet above it. So we're fine with all the conditions. The application meets all the requirements. If you have any questions at all for us going forward, we're here and a representative from the entity as well as here.
We're not repaving the whole lot, we're just repaving that section, recovering it.
Yes, yeah. So we're not repaving the whole lot. Great point. I think maybe I misspoke. We're going to be resealing the lot and restriping, and just that section we will, based on the issues raised by staff, we will be correcting the southeast corner.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I'd move to open the public hearing, affording the public an opportunity to speak at 7:24.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Seeing no public comment, I will move to close the public hearing at 7:25. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Comments, questions from the Planning Commission members? Yes.
Regarding the air handling, is there a certification process? Are there specialists who have unique tools to check out your air handling and to make sure that it's installed properly and does what you think it does?
Yeah, so a part of getting the state license from the CRA is we will go through an intensive BFS, Bureau of Fire and Services review, where they will come out and inspect the property on site to make sure that everything is compliant with state law. But a part of that is you're checking it, but there is not a, I guess, more intensive third-party requirement under the current statute for air services, but we do have to get BFS review for on-site inspection of our facility. And that's mandated by the state.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
How many of your other facilities that you mentioned are standalone versus being part of a shopping center?
Yes. None of them are actually part of a shopping center. We have a freestanding building in East Lansing. We have a freestanding building in Kalkaska, and we have a building in Kalamazoo, which is a bunch of storefronts like your downtown area, that store to store to store. So that would be sort of comparable to a shopping center, but not a shopping center per se, sir.
So in that example that you said where you had it in a storefront, has there been any concerns or complaints at that?
Absolutely none, none, zero. And as Sam pointed out, all of our goods, and this can be stipulated as part of the approval, all of our goods are prepackaged. They're sealed, they're weighed, they're barcoded, so there's no, they call it deli-style service of the cannabis. We don't do any of that. We do it for a number of reasons. One for the smells and odors and so forth. Others is for, just internal controls. We know exactly how much is going into the stores, exactly how much is sold. It's better controls internally in terms of the amount being sold. But there's absolutely no odors whatsoever in the stores.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this discussion about odor, I don't think we're smart enough to know what equipment works and what doesn't work at the point of approval, but I think we're smart enough to know when it doesn't work, when there's a business in operation. And so I think our best approach to this is a very aggressive and assertive management of these situations, because we approved them all with the expectation they be harmonious to other businesses. So I would encourage the city to be very intentional and very aggressive about enforcement of our expectations. It's more of an editorial comment because we're talking about it. It has very little to do with this applicant, but I feel like it's important for us to have our wishes honored and respected as part of the approval process of harmonious existence of these kinds of companies, because if they can't be that, we don't want them, I don't think we should want them in this town.
Yeah. Mr. Beardsley point, so odor is also a nuisance use in our section 7.5 of our code. Once again, this is going to be something I have to talk to legal counsel about, given the language used here, such as that it can't unreasonably mess with or interfere with the comfort of the public. Would that apply if they're on a private shopping center? It would be another kind of conversation to have there. But to Mr. Beardsley's point, the SLU approval has strict conversations about nuisances being caused, and I think that would be grounds potentially for revocation of an SLU, which would then jeopardize the license and the zoning and everything else that would go with these enterprises, and definitely a route that I will also pose to our attorney.
I would just add that, in my judgment, there is no reasonable reason to vote against the subsequent motion to approve. The applicant has done a more than reasonable job meeting our zoning and planning requirements, and so by law, we're compelled to approve the petitioner's request, noting, of course, that there probably are some additional conditions that can be made on the subsequent motion. The rationale for my previous line of questioning to Mr. Harrington is that I truly believe, not only as mayor and as a council member, but as a community member, we're getting very close to the tipping point of oversaturation in our area. Not just Saline, but in broader Washtenaw County. There are plenty of opportunities for people to partake and purchase cannabis-related products in our area. So the market will, of course, decide a lot of these questions, but I wish you well. My only encouragement is to try and make yourself different and unique than the existing enterprises that are already in operation within the community. That's all I have, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Additional discussion? Is there a motion on the table to approve, not approve, or approve with conditions? The 1 through 8 that are enumerated below, we have also talked about revising the elevation to show the sign areas, the northeast corner with the no parking striping, and then also the asphalt on the southwest corner, directly in front of the dance building.
Mr. Gearbaugh mentioned something about odor, which the petitioner said, or at least it implied that he would welcome, or be comfortable with, rather.
Not the ones that I have listed, I had compliance with the signage ordinance, current and future, if we can do that, considering we're voting on it tonight. Can we do something in terms of the condition related to signage, in terms of our current and the future one that's going to be voted on in the next?
Right, so nothing would change, nothing's being proposed to change on the amount of building signage allowed from the ordinance later tonight. So unless anyone anticipates that, you could just say has to follow the standards as of 7/26/2023.
Because I'm worried about, I don't want to see a variance for a larger sign or some other change in the.
I mean, I think a variance case in this specific instance would be rather difficult to say that the existing amount of signage is simply unusable. Obviously, that's not the case for the dance studio.
So the statement signage complies with.
Section, yes.
Okay, just make sure that's for the minutes. And then the curbside, same statement that you made before about curbside, until the city has such an ordinance that curbside would not be allowed.
Yes.
And then the other one was, I mean, I have no problem with the idea that we're talking about prepackaged, which would help address this odor aspect if we want to go that route.
If that's the wish of the planning commission, I think that condition is acceptable.
And that would be the other one that I'm so I've identified at this point. I am curious though, High Society, they do their own mixing and everything?
I would have to go back and look at the record. There's a chance that they have some deli-style operations where they are handing out flour in a non-prepackaged manner, but I simply don't know at this time, so.
I just thought that was something associated with processing versus actual retail, so, okay. That was just a question for me. So yeah, those three additional conditions.
3 in addition to the 8, Mr. Gearbaugh?
Correct. And I'll make that motion.
I will second that motion. Additional discussion. All right, we have a motion on the table to approve with the 11 conditions, the application for Martin Stoneman of Compassionate Advisors LLC for a final site plan for an adult-use marijuana retailer, remodeling the existing 1,760 square foot suite within the structure to create a retail space at 813 West Michigan Avenue, Saline, Michigan, 48176. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Unfinished business. Number 23-15, zoning amendment, creating ordinance number 856, an ordinance to amend the zoning ordinance for Appendix A, Article 2, 4, 13, to define, permit, and regulate accessory dwelling units. In our packet, we have a memo dated July 20th, 2023 from Community Development Director Harrington, a memo dated March 16th from Community Development Director Harrington, a memo dated March 17th from Planner Auerbach, and that's it.
I believe, okay, so this is ADUs, never mind. You're free to go if you'd like, or you can stick around, it's up to you. So as we just went over, this is action item 2313. It's an update of our ordinance 856. It is a zoning ordinance amendment, touches many different aspects of our code. The location, as we've talked about with other code amendments, is the citywide change. ADUs are specifically zoned, or specifically set to be for the R2 district, but proposed changes to accessory structures affect all residential properties within the community, not just those within the R2, which is why this has been brought back. And I kept a comment from when we originally brought this forward. Similar to the chicken keeping ordinance, the regulation does not usurp private deed agreements, which are HOAs, or maybe private leases that folks have with one another. So you have kind of a long background on this. I know that might be hard to read. Essentially, a variance was requested last spring for an accessory dwelling unit. The variance was granted, but ultimately the city's preference was to pursue a formal policy. Code review met at length through last year and fall to develop the mechanics of the ordinance. They reviewed a draft of the final ordinance at their February 22nd meeting. Code review suggested a few minor modifications, which were reflected in the ordinance before you all on that March 22nd day. Planning Commission recommended approval of the ordinance at their March 22nd meeting on a 7-1 vote. When it went to the City Council, they requested that it be reviewed by the Historic District Commission before taking action. The Historic District Commission had the opportunity to review the ordinance and only commented that they thought the ordinance was too restrictive and should be opened up to the R1 district sooner. Council then reviewed it again and then believed the Planning Commission had not adequately addressed or considered the proposed changes in height for detached accessory structures for all residential districts. At the June 28th meeting, we had a discussion on this, and it was elucidated that several commissioners were not aware of this change and asked for the opportunity for further review. So now here we are at the end of it. Item is back again for your formal review, consideration, and recommendation to City Council. So we're going to do this a little bit differently than how we usually do it. I'll give you kind of the meat of the updates, and then I'm going to show you exactly where in the ordinance it says these things, because I think it's important that we all kind of have a same page to drop off of and to know, how to maybe read these ordinances going forward and maybe just assist us all in making sure that we catch information on the chance that it's missed in my memo or Mike's memo, et cetera. So the change in this article establishes the definition for accessory dwelling units, which is here, dwelling unit accessory, a dwelling unit that provides complete independent living facilities for not more than one family, which is defined in our code already, and is an accessory use of single-family dwelling. ADUs may be integral to the principal dwelling, meaning inside of it, attached to the principal dwelling, outside of it, or located in a detached structure altogether on the same lot. So here's that specific section in highlighted language. This is the red line version that was submitted to you in your packets. So the highlighted is what has been changed, and that's the quote I just read you verbatim. Article 4 updates are a little bit more elaborate, so they're split over several slides. So it adds the important caveat to the number of buildings allowed on a site. So this is one of those things that Saline has a standard on, and because we're potentially allowing more than one building on a site, we had to modify the code slightly. So there will be only one principal single-family dwelling permitted per lot. One accessory dwelling unit may be permitted as an accessory use to single-family dwelling, subject to the requirements of this ordinance. Again, this doesn't create a contradictory loophole, so we had to establish it. We then also went through and removed some of the links of our use standards as it relates to accessory buildings and structures. So previously, accessory uses were allowed broadly, and then it was R1A, R1B, R1C, just said all allowed uses in these previous districts. Well, one of the issues when you do that is something we actually went through with the marijuana ordinance with the industrial district, because our industrial district hyperlinks, so to speak, to our commercial standards, we were accidentally essentially legalizing marijuana in the industrial 1 district. So in order to close those loopholes going forward, it's just really helpful to list what we're saying is allowed or what we're saying is not allowed. So in all of our residential, single-family residential districts, they has this one. And then for our R2, you'll notice that it adds accessory dwelling units subject to the requirements of section 5.20. So there can't be really any mysticism with our residents about where these are and are not allowed. It is specifically stated as its own standalone item only in the R2 district. And it also goes into the purpose or the definition of what the R2 district is. Accessory dwelling units on lots with single-family dwellings are also compatible with the R2 district. So that settles Article 4, which are purposes and uses within zoning codes. Article 5 updates. We make ADUs exempt from the residential building size requirements of our code. So our code not only regulates lot size, but it actually regulates the footprint of the home that you can have too, which is somewhat unique to Saline. It's other suburban and rural municipalities have also adopted similar codes. So again, we're just saying the size of the dwelling does not apply to accessory dwelling units. In addition, the floor area of an accessory dwelling unit shall not count towards the minimum floor area of a principal dwelling. So you can't build a small house and an ADU and combine them together to meet our code limit. You have to build a house at that standard still, which is something we may choose to reevaluate with density considerations, but for the moment, we can leave it where it is. And this is kind of the bulk of the changes and the thing about why we really came back. So it's the clarifies and streamlines our accessory structure standards, removing preferences for the structures being specifically a garage, and changes the height standard. So previously in our code, we had a standard that said you could have a garage that's above 200 square feet, and then you can have any type of other accessory structure or building that's under 200 square feet. Well, not everyone wants a large detached garage. Sometimes they want a pergola. Sometimes they want a large shed that they have no intention of parking a car in, maybe a large play structure or playhouse for their kid that would technically fall under this definition in some cases. So we remove that discrimination, so to speak, between what you're using that structure for. But then importantly, in point 2 of detached accessory buildings and structures, we say one detached accessory structure per residential lot is permitted and shall not exceed 24 feet in height or the height of the principal structure on the same lot, whichever is less. All other detached accessory structures shall not exceed 14 feet in height. So you're allowed one large structure and one small structure, one that can be 24 feet in height or the height of the house or less, and then one that has to remain under that 14-foot limit, as is the current code. And then you're allowed one structure On this right-hand side, you'll see there under 8,000 square feet, 8 to 12, over 12, those are lot sizes, and then that's the largest accessory structure you could have, and then everyone in the city is allowed an additional detached accessory structure under 200 square feet. So this is where those changes were made. It is possible, if it is the Planning Commission's interest, to just make that height allowance only in the R2 district. So if that's the way that we want to solve this issue, if that's fundamentally the issue here, that's absolutely something we have the capacity as a staff and as a body to just recommend that be changed, and it's something I can do with a simple line item, that in the R2 district, have that standard, and then keep it the same for everybody else as it currently is. So I just wanted to throw that out there in case that is the Planning Commission's intent. Next, there's an amendment to the yard use section that further clarifies where accessory structures can be located. So detached accessory structures and buildings may be located in the side or rear yards, subject to the requirements of this ordinance. Driveways may be extended into the side or rear yards to service a detached or attached garage. That is already the case with our code. The language of garage is neither here nor there in this specific instance. And it just ensures that people aren't putting these structures in their front yard, because it was written ambiguously enough that on a corner lot, there was potentially an allowance of that structure, and that's not the way that the city's ever enforced that, but we wanted to be really clear that that's not what can happen. And then lastly, it sets ADU standards, and because this was long, I just did the summary on the side how I usually do. So it sets the limit of 1 ADU per parcel. It requires ADUs to comply with accessory structure standards. It sets identical floor area standards as accessory structures. It refers to off-street parking requirements, and then it allows sewer and water questions to be provided by connection to the existing services for the principal building, or the owner and engineer can require that the connection be separate. So the owner can instigate a separate sewer water connection. Our city engineer can instigate that connection. Otherwise, they're welcome to join it off the main line. There are still discrepancies with the city of Ann Arbor and the state building code that they're working out, and we're kind of following their lead on how they're going to choose to implement that, because the state building code says each dwelling unit essentially needs its separate connection. But it's something that the building code people are aware of, and they're actively working on how to resolve that contingency. And then lastly, we have Article 13 updates, and it essentially just says you have to provide 1 additional parking spot per accessory dwelling unit. Because you're limited to 1 accessory dwelling unit, it would be you have to provide 1 additional parking spot. So that could be in the driveway, that could be in a garage, provided that it's not overhanging the sidewalk and it's fully kept on your property. But someone with a very narrow and very short driveway is likely going to struggle to meet that standard, and it would be grounds to deny them permit for accessory dwelling. We have not received any formal public comment on this ordinance. It's been a question asked on the master plan. It received mixed feedback one way or the other. I guess mixed, but it kind of ambivalent, indifferent feedback. There was no strong opinion on it. So really the outstanding questions for the Planning Commission to discuss, as this ordinance has already come before you, are there aspects of this ordinance upon further review that you would like to be modified?
Thank you.
Madam Chair, can I venture such impertinence? At our pre-meeting to discuss the master plan town hall tomorrow, I asked Mr. Beardsley, who at the time was the Planning Commission liaison to the code review, who wrote the initial draft, if he'd be willing to comment at this time and provide just a little bit of additional perspective, not only in terms of his thoughts on the proposed ordinance, but also the work that went into this at the code review level.
Certainly, Mr. Mayor. Before I actually do that, just want to clarify your question on the height and whether or not we apply a different standard to the R2 versus R1. So as currently proposed, we're trying to take it to 24 feet maximum in R2, and currently it's 14 in R1, but that would not be a dwelling unit. That would just be an accessory unit. Is that right?
No. So the issue is that the standard applies to all residential districts. So all residential districts, and it's regardless of whether it's being used as a dwelling unit or a shed or a garage, would be allowed to then have that structure be at 24 feet in height, or the height of the house, whichever is less, is proposed.
Right.
Now, right, if you would like to modify it, it would be that we could only allow that to be 24 feet in height or the height of the house in the R2 district, because the current standard across the board is 14 feet.
Right.
Sorry,
Exactly what I meant, but currently it's 14 feet, and there is no dwelling unit, accessory dwelling unit allowed in an R1, and so that would be the difference. You'd allow the 24 in the R2 because you would have an accessory dwelling unit capability, and you would not allow, or you potentially would not allow it in the R1 because that would just be a big garage or whatever.
Correct.
Yeah. So the only question is, do we want to allow 24 in R1, even though they won't be accessory dwelling units?
At this time, yes.
Yes.
I think that's the meat of the question, at least is the concerns that were raised to me. So.
But isn't the issue, you defined auxiliary building, it wasn't auxiliary dwelling unit?
Correct.
So that any auxiliary building could be built to the height of 24 in the R1 district, not just an ADU.
Right, yeah, yes.
Yeah, I just want to clarify.
Right, so we just need to be intentional about whatever we're going to approve here to either allow that or not allow that in R1.
Correct.
The same standard, okay. Because I was part of the code review committee and ZBA when this first came up, and we were enthusiastic to seeing how accessory dwelling units would complement the city and would allow greater density of housing and greater opportunities for housing in smaller spaces. There was a lot of discussion, as I recall, on height, because you might look at a second floor of a garage, and that might be higher than 14 feet, but that may be a perfect accessory dwelling unit. So I totally support the idea of going up to 24 feet. I'm really have no conviction as to whether or not the 24 should apply to R1 or we should keep it at 14. That's an entirely different matter than the accessory dwelling unit ordinance that we were discussing. As far as setbacks, I know we also discussed that quite a bit. Should we allow a little intrusion into setbacks? And that was, I think, a harder thing for most members of the Code Review Committee to reconcile. And I think that's probably about it. I think there was overall a great appreciation for what ADUs would do for the city and for the options for housing.
Now, on the setback issue, I do understand that a detached ADU can be up to 3 feet from the property line, so that's a significant difference from a principal structure setback.
Correct.
That is correct. I will add, too, that our code says it has to be separated 6 feet from a structure on the other property. The only reason it's done that because there are some structures that we would define as structures that it could be per the building code within 6 feet of, but if it was another garage, the building code would necessitate that it's 10 feet. So the standard is not perfectly aligned, but there's a reason for that. And like I said, it's just because we define structures somewhat differently than the building code. It could be near someone's shed where they're not putting something with, like a motor vehicle inside of it or a person, but it could not be near another person's garage, which has other implications. So,
And let me say one more thing as to whether or not this should be beyond the R2 areas. The Code Review Committee felt like, since this was new, that we would take a more conservative view of allowing this in the city before we would expand it further. Because if you went out with both R1 and R2, it'd be almost impossible to bring it back. Whereas if we go out with R2 and it works really well, you could therefore expand it over time if you wanted to.
absolutely.
Yes.
Just a couple things. Mr. Harrington, you were mentioning about, you can only have one additional auxiliary unit besides the ADU. And you said a pergola, but what if someone wanted a pergola in a shed?
It would technically not be allowed per our code.
All right, so if I wanted to have a gazebo, an ADU, and my primary house,
That would be acceptable
that would
because,
be acceptable?
well, provided the gazebo is under.
Not having a
Under
shed.
200.
Correct, yes. Now, that said, a lot of people buy these, like, even I am guilty of it in Ann Arbor. Don't tell the Ann Arbor zoning police, but I have like a very small prefab shed, and technically, by our own standards, you would need to pull a permit for that. Even if it's something you got that's, not even tall enough to fit a person in it, you would still technically need a permit for that per our own code. That's how all municipalities write it. Ultimately, that comes down to an enforcement issue, and it's a very difficult thing to enforce because, how long is someone going to keep these little junky prefab plastic sheds like the one I purchased? It's meant to survive the last of my tenancy, not meant to last with the property.
And that would, even the chicken coop issue?
So yes, that chicken coop would also fall under this issue as well.
Somebody asked me a question. Do we still define a garage, or is that gone now?
I believe we do define a garage technically.
Because I didn't know if there were any unique circumstances with a garage potentially either having, now it's going to be electrical vehicle charges, but because of past issues where you've had fires or things that are more possible with a car in the garage than
Yes, so we do define a garage as an accessory building or portion of a main building designed solely designed or used solely for the storage of motor-driven vehicles, boats, house trailers, and similar vehicles owned and used by the occupants of the building to which it is accessory.
So when you build a garage and an ADU at the same time, what's that how's that defined as? So I'm saying you're building, the first floor is a garage, you build the second floor as an ADU. Is there anything?
There would be a lot of fire protection that would be required per the building code because of the use of
Building code
storage.
issues.
Yes, those are far more building code issues than anything with our zoning code. I think we've done a good job at making sure we've reconciled what we need to within the zoning code. It sounds like the issue of height is the only outstanding thing we're left on that sense.
And the one thing you mentioned about, the water connections and so forth. So is there a way for us to require that a second meter be required for that dwelling?
I could ask Attorney Chubb about that and have an answer for the city council. I don't think I could provide an answer sooner than that.
Because, one of the ideas is to provide additional density in housing, but the other issue is we need to be able to capture the costs of providing water to that additional structure.
Right, it would definitely have to be metered. So if even it went through the principal structure, it couldn't be something you place in on your what's the word I'm looking for, your connection prior to the meter.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we aren't running a pipe from the main process to the auxiliary dwelling unit and not having a second unit.
No, it would assuredly have to go through some sort of plumbing inspection, so that would be something our plumbing inspector, Mr. Feldkamp, would ensure was done properly. And it's something he's caught before, to be candid with you. People do try to cheat that system, so.
So that would be something we would address in our own water service. And then when you mentioned about parking, how do we establish for the existing structure, and then you said there had to be parking for the auxiliary dwelling unit, what's the standards for the existing structure and the new structure? Are they both separate and would be?
Right, so there's a standard from a home that every home, I believe here, we can go back to that slide. So for every home, every detached unit, you need 2 parking spaces, and then for the accessory, you would need 1. We have standards on the length of that space, so we would measure the length versus the length of your driveway, as well as any parking you might have in a garage. So if you could fit 2 cars side by side in your driveway, you're good. If you could fit 2 cars in your driveway end to end and 1 in the garage, the parking concern and the shuffling of the parking that you have to do as a property owner is not really the city's concern at that point, provided that it's all staying on your property.
So any of the buildings we currently would convert into a 2-family dwelling would now require 4 parking spaces?
I believe so. I would just have to double check that real quick because there might be a slightly, so it's 2 per each dwelling unit for a multiple family as well.
Okay. Something about restriction. Oh, impervious surfaces, sorry. When you mentioned about being able to put in the driveway, where are we on our impervious surface ordinance?
Yeah, so it's something I've reached out to Sally Balsam out at OHM as well as Marcus McNamara. So for those of you who are unaware, the city regulates lot coverage, which is how we define it as the percentage of a lot that's covered by a structure. And that absolutely has stormwater implications if you have a roof over it. About 30 years ago, most cities adopted what's called an impervious surface ordinance, which regulates the paved and hard surfaces or surfaces that cannot allow water to pass through them, pavement primarily. Saline has never done that for some reason, so it's something we definitely need to look into because it does really have all these stormwater implications. And many of our industrial businesses, for example, have really paved the entirety of their lots. So there's a lot of lost green space, a lot of lost grass, a lot of lost stormwater capture as a result of that. So it's something we need to pursue. However, we're going to create nonconformities with it, and I don't imagine it's going to be particularly popular because it really does limit what people can do with their properties.
That's where I'm concerned on this one. You have to require 4 parking spaces. You're basically going to be turning a yard into a parking lot.
Well, if you have a 2-car garage and your driveway can accommodate both those cars to go in and you can park outside, like I said, if they have to shuffle, it's on them as the property owner and whoever is choosing to allow the ADU essentially to figure out how they're going to negotiate that process.
And as you and I have discussed, a prime example is the giant parking lot that is of those 2 houses on North Maple, which
Yes.
are in and out 2 areas. So that kind of example is why I'm wondering here, and how would we adjust that so when somebody does build an auxiliary dwelling unit, they don't necessarily put in 4 more parking spaces to comply with this and then basically pay it.
Absolutely.
That's it for me right now.
Thank you.
So the definition of ADU also includes integral to the principal dwelling. And I'm just curious, is that just referring to like an internal unit?
Yes.
So
Yeah,
like
so-
an apartment for another
Yeah, so-
unrelated resident?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the best example is actually the house I grew up in had a separate entrance and exit from the basement. And there was a way that we could have technically curb cutted our house in a separate way and created a second unit in our basement to accommodate that. I mean, obviously, that wasn't my family's desire to do it. But yeah, it would be an example like either you have a walkout basement or you have a bonus room with a fire escape that was put there in the 1900s because it used to be multi-tenant, things like that.
Madam Chair, if there are no additional questions, I'd move to acknowledge receipt of the memos dated July 20th, March the 16th, and March the 17th.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Additional questions or comments from Planning Commission members?
Madam Chair, only that I support the resolution. I think this gives us some opportunities for housing for new folks or existing folks. It also serves our aging population well by bringing some seniors closer to home to be able to stay. And in most cases, I think these ADAs will be less expensive than individual units. So that's going to bring, I think, some greater diversity of age and other factors into the community.
Thank you. Yes.
And just to clarify, this will only be in the R2, so the height restriction of 14 feet will still continue in the R1.
Please make that recommendation, and I will update the ordinance. I just brought it forward to how it was, but yes, I think that was what Mr. Beardsley had expressed, and I think that's a very easy change we can make.
I concur with Mr. Beardsley. I mean, that was my intent with this, and because one of the issues that we ran in, even in the HDC, was where a lot of these homes potentially could be, we had an individual, and this was a discretionary aspect of the HDC, they denied the height of a building at one house and was going to allow it at another. And so that discretionary aspect caused confusion in the historic district where a lot of this activity is going to happen. So I think the ability to allow for that height up to 24 feet in the R2 district, where we're hoping most of this will take place at this point in time, seems reasonable and should move forward with that. And as Mr. Beardsley had mentioned, rolling it out without rolling it out to the entire city makes sense because in the past we, as we know, have overstepped our bounds and haven't been able to roll it back in. So, thank you.
Should we add an amendment that the dwelling units, or accessory, are only 14 feet high in the other residential?
How do you need to fix that?
Well, I mean, if you just make the recommendation, I'll just bring the new proposed ordinance. That's what I've done with code. It's the process I started with. Rather than just bringing you what they said in the ordinance unchanged, I just changed the ordinance based on their recommendations. And unless there's been some sort of, I haven't been told it's been an egregious misstep or anything, so I would just recommend that change. And it's something, it's like I said, it's hitting enter once, copy pasting, and taking out 2 words. So
I would say move to recommend to City Council to adopt the new ordinance exclusive to the R2 zoning area.
yeah, you could just say with the height, with the proposed height of accessory structures left exclusively to the R2 district, retaining the standards for the others, or something to that effect. I think it's rather clear what we're going for in the grand scheme of things.
Mr. Kerbach, you're good with 24 feet, only in the proposed height of the ADU can be 24 feet only in the R2 district, 14 feet or what is existing will remain for all other districts.
Perfect.
Correct? Okay.
Up to 24 feet.
Up.
I like the idea that we still maintain that it isn't bigger than the house.
Correct, please,
Up
yes.
to 24 feet only in the R2 district, 14 feet for all additional districts following the existing code. So that's your motion. I will second that. Any additional discussion?
Yeah, I do have a question about it. So the section 5.03, I understand that applies generally not just to the R2. So when we're talking about clarifying and stating that in R1, the maximum height is going to remain 14 feet, are we going to say that the additional changes in section 503 are effective in R1? In other words, it's the only change from what is sitting before us now that we're going to limit the height in R1 to 14, but the other changes will also apply to R1?
That's my preference simply because I don't see the purpose in discriminating based on whether your residents are using that as a garage or as, like I said, a shed or a pergola or a gazebo or whatever else. So if you're fine removing the discrimination, that it doesn't necessarily, the larger structure doesn't necessarily have to be a garage. That is the only other fundamental change proposed here.
And just to be clear, and I'm trying to interpret Dean's amendment, at the end of the day, what is sitting before us is what we're recommending to council, with the sole change that we're saying that the 24-foot height allowance or the height of the house will be exclusive to
Yes.
R2. Okay. With that, I'm satisfied.
And I hate to throw a wrench in it, but just asking this question. So I'm in the R1 district. I want to build on a new addition to my house, has a garage and a second floor, but attached to the house, will that cause a problem?
No, you can already do that. So if it's attached to the
I
house,
just want
yeah.
to make sure we haven't
Yeah.
stopped that, because that issue already, the building already exists, all you're doing is increasing the size of the existing.
Right, it would run into issues. That's where that lot coverage thing I mentioned earlier comes in. But yeah,
Yeah, maybe just to wrap this up, Madam Chair, I'm going to echo a lot of the sentiments that were shared earlier, especially by Commissioner Beardsley. I think that this is very much a net positive for the community, and it helps us achieve our goals, not accomplish the goal, but helps us move in the right direction of diversifying, expanding our housing stock, and creating more affordable options for existing residents and future residents. I enthusiastically support the motion as presented and will be an advocate for its adoption at the city council level. I would note, because I had an extensive conversation with the chair of code review on this subject probably about a month ago now, I think it's something that ought to be carefully monitored and evaluated over the next year and a half, but I fully expect that this initiative will be successful, and if it is, I think it ought to be something that is emulated and expanded elsewhere in the community. As it's written now, fine, appropriate, but I think we should very much keep it on our radar and revisit the issue likely in 2024 or 2025. With that, I'll yield the floor, and I'll be voting in the affirmative on the motion.
Yes.
Just one other thing, I want to appreciate Mr. Harrington for addressing this and helping us. And it is that issue of how we can better be more informed, working with you, but to understand these changes in the future. And I think that was one of the reasons why I brought this back. And it was that aspect, I think, going forward, however we approach this and our other issues and things would be helpful. And I think we talked about that. And whatever else we maybe need to talk with you in terms of what we need in order to make a better discussion and a full discussion so that we understand everything would be beneficial.
right, absolutely. I would like to add a discussion item about how we're submitting information to you at the end of this, but we can hop into that at the end of the sign code, which I hope will go relatively quickly because I don't want to keep you all too long. So
I'll call the question on this, Madam Chair.
Okay. All good? All right. We have a motion on the floor, moved by Dean, seconded by me, to recommend to City Council to adopt with the revision of the 24 feet only, up to 24 feet only in the R2. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Number 23-16, zoning amendment creating ordinance number 857, an ordinance to amend the zoning ordinance for Appendix A, Article 2 and 12, to define and further clarify the parameters and procedures for the regulation of signs. We have memos dated July 18th, 2023, and June 9th, 2023, and April 20th, 2023, from Community Development Director Harrington.
perfect. Yeah. So the amount of memos is exactly what the discussion thing is going to be about. So fun surprise there. So it's ordinance 857. It's the third time this ordinance has now come before the Planning Commission. It's action item 2316, and it's our sign standards. So it's a citywide change, as was the last zoning ordinance you just considered. None of our standards for residential properties are changing, including that of temporary signs, which would be lawn signs in this instance. The proposed changes primarily affect commercial businesses, but also have now affected public and quasi-public users, which would be primarily churches and private schools in our community. Like other ordinances, it does not usurp private deed agreements or leases. Shopping centers commonly have restrictions on what types of signage you can have, the size of it, the style of it. So our sign standards don't usurp their ability to enforce that on their own selves. So for some background, the Planning and City Council adopted a revised sign code in summer of 2022. The goal was to bring us into compliance with local and federal court cases, as the previous sign code was heavily content-based. Staff discovered several problems with the temporary sign section after its adoption, and some known signage problems remained unresolved. I brought this ordinance to code review, who recommended a few minor modifications, primarily looking at the instance of clarity, and that was reflected in the formal ordinance document that was presented to you in April. The Planning Commission reviewed and made recommendations on temporary signs, incidental signs, window signs, definitions, and other items at their 2 meetings on this topic. The bulk of the decisions left to be made today are really related to temporary signs, as that remains our outstanding issue. So just to give us a recap, because it is a rather large update. So the elements being changed are definitions. So we changed the definitions of incidental signs. We created a definition for vehicle signs, and we improved the definition for window signs. So it's not something that's just attached to the window, but it's something that sits right inside the window, which is important. Speaking of vehicle signs, there's a strict prohibition of vehicle signs. Our attorney and I discovered that using the definition of portable sign, you could make the same argument. I think this just makes it clear. We've had issues with vehicle billboards in our community in the past few months. I would like to make sure that they don't come back. They're a distraction and they're a hazard ubiquitously. So I would like to get rid of them altogether, and I think that's a pretty common sense approach to do it. We also had an unenforceable prohibition of banners. It was too generic, our attorney deemed. So we're removing the prohibition of banners, but we're reconciling the issue that was trying to be addressed at that time by limiting temporary sign height. We'll get to that in a second. For window sign and balloon standards, we're classifying them how they've always been enforced as a sign without a need for a permit. However, we are retaining the 25% window coverage rule, and there is an aspect there that we can talk about too, about whether we want that to be 25% of any given window or 25% of the total window coverage, which is how I'm currently interpreting and enforcing that code. Additionally, we addressed incidental signs for schools, allows schools to have larger incidental signs for the purpose of identification and direction. So in the previous code, it was 2 square feet, and the new one we're proposing is 12, and they're allowed to have 2 of those. That was talked at length at our last meeting. Next, it was the second ground sign on internal access roads, so it cannot be visible from the street. But this is something I've heard some larger businesses of ours express that they would like to maybe have some internal signage to navigate their customers or their clients to various divisions. And this is also something that was uniquely proposed to me by the private school that's coming into our community. Given their campus and their access drive, they would like to have a second monument sign essentially to reflect that, yes, they're here. It's not normally something we do to give such deference to a proposed enterprise, but they are a unique user in our community. Our zoning code does not apply to public schools, which makes us have a unique issue with private schools that come in, as our code was never written to accommodate for them. Next up, our ground sign distance from the right-of-way has changed. It's going from 15 feet to 10 feet, which is another very common complaint I get from businesses. However, it still must meet the clear vision rule. So currently, it has to be 15 feet from the driveway and 15 feet from the right-of-way. And no matter how you scale that, if it moves further from the driveway, it still has to be that 15 feet from the right-of-way. It's not an issue I have a particular concern about because we're still establishing that it can't block people's vision on the road. So we have a very strict clear vision standard that we do enforce with structures. Vehicles are a different story, I know. But and then we allow building signs for public, quasi-public users, which in this case are primarily going to be churches and private schools. Actually not the private school in this instance, but churches. It informally allowed sometimes, but not with an obvious or clear standard for enforcement. So we have some churches that have building signs, but without a clear standard that they were abiding by. So this would allow them to use it in the same way that a professional business zone operation could use it. A building sign, so Fifth Corner would be the primary example. They just switch their sign to the name of the church. But it establishes a consistent guideline, and I think it's a fair guideline. It's limiting the signage in residential neighborhoods as opposed to commercial neighborhoods, but still providing them an opportunity to navigate folks and show them who they are. It improves our campaign sign standards. It added needed provisions for non-residential properties. It allows for more signs, but not larger signs. The total of 64 square foot of signage is allowed per non-residential property during campaign season. It overhauls our temporary sign standards, and as I mentioned, that's going to be something we have more discussion on. And then lastly, it removes our sign contractor registration requirement. We talked about this at our first meeting on this topic, but it's an item that essentially said the city had to specially register and license contractors outside of the state's process and outside of our own typical registration and renewal of insurance for contractors. I only am aware of 2 cities that do this, and that would be Detroit and Grand Rapids. And they obviously have specialty reasons given their size for the need to do that. Signs are kind of specialty work. They're not exactly building. They're not exactly electrical. So this state also provides a sign installation license as well. So it's redundant, and it's not something we've ever done as a community, so it just makes sense to not have that standard in our code anymore. At our last meeting, we discussed some of the elements going to stay the same. One is the prohibitions of electronic signs in residentially zoned areas. This is seemingly the consensus of the Planning Commission the last time we had this conversation, although if there's still more conversation to be had, I would encourage you to have it. The square footage limits on both building signs and on monument or ground signs are remaining the same as they've always been. It's why there wasn't as much engagement with the business community this time around on this update, because fundamentally their exterior signage is not changing, and we're not making things non-conforming in any substantial way. And then most other aspects not discussed here have remained the same in our sign code, such as abandoned signs, projection allowances for our downtown businesses, the means of how we compute the size of the sign for like channel lettering, for example. Residential yard signs have remained the same, and they're, the purpose and the intent of the code have largely remained pretty much exactly what they were, with some minor tweaks to, again, kind of cut out any sort of illusion of content-based regulation. So moving on, we are still left with our temporary sign conundrum. So Saline has historically permitted temporary signs in different shapes, sizes, and locations based on content. It's an inappropriate and unfortunately legally perilous way to regulate signs. The sign code adopted last summer is specifically problematic because it removed almost all regulations surrounding content, but then the leftover was a variety of conflicting regulations with no number or a cap or necessarily anything associated with what our current temporary signs could be. So as a result, we have a sign code that effectively contradicts itself and is very difficult to enforce. So we have the existing option that I proposed, which would be to regulate on-site temporary signs and off-site temporary signs, because the Supreme Court deems that as a content-neutral way to regulate. But per the conversation at the last meeting, I have also created a unified standard for all temporary signs for your consideration. So we're just regulating all signs in the property, or all temporary signs in the property in the same way, regardless of who the user or whether it's on-site or off-site is. It's one of the more efficient ways to do it, but we can go over the two. So option one is on-site temporary signs. It would allow one temporary sign per parcel, subject to the height and area requirements below. Signs may be placed for up to 30 consecutive days. The property owner must wait 30 days after the sign was last up before placing another temporary sign. Non-residential users in residential zones, such as public, quasi-public users primarily, would conform to the PB district, which is how we do it for all other types of signs. And then for off-site temporary signs, we would allow 4 off-site temporary signs, and the specific language would be up to 4 off-site temporary signs may be placed on non-residential properties at a time. Such signs are not to exceed 16 square feet per side or 6 feet in height. Such signs shall not be displayed for more than 10 days. Permission must be obtained from the property owner prior to placement of any sign. A permit is not required for this type of sign. And this is our second option, which is to collapse them all. And there are aspects of this that I like better that we might want to bring over if we keep the first option, and I think that will be where the meat of our discussion is. So essentially, and all of this is also subject to your changes. So if you want to change sizes, if you want to change the number, all of it is fair game. So we would allow 4 non-residential temporary signs shall be permitted per parcel, except those signs where an additional number is permitted in the time frame and conditions specified in this ordinance. And that would be real estate signs, so things for sale, and that would be campaign season are the primary examples of that. And then construction activity is the other one. So we have a maximum area in sign per square footage, and we have a maximum allowed on the total parcel. And then we still keep the 30-day rule, so 30 days on and then 30 days off, and it's the collective. So all of your signs, it doesn't matter how many you have out in that 30-day period, it could be up, and then you can't have any signs for the next 30 days, and then you can have up to 4 again, and then none can be up for 30 days. And any time in that 30 days, you can place a combination of 4 signs, but at the end of the 30 days, they all have to be down for a period of 30 days. So that would be one way to approach it. I think there are merits to doing it this way. I think there are merits to doing it the other way. And I'm definitely open to any suggestions or comments you might have on it. Considerations for the Planning Commission are: what points are there or questions, confusion on? What is your preference on temporary sign regulation? And then per our conversation, I come up with some other caveats we could always add to this, like prohibiting non-real estate temporary signs on undeveloped or vacant lots, keeping the allowed time of display of off-site temporary signs, which is on a 7-day schedule rather than on a 30-day schedule, but otherwise having them conform to the on-site temporary signs allowance in this code. I think that's a particularly difficult thing to enforce, but we can get into that. And then, again, we can further limit the maximum size of temporary signs. So for reference, a campaign sign is about 3 square feet, and we're currently proposing to allow about 16 to 32 square feet per sign. So.
Yes.
I apologize if I missed this. Are you making a distinction between a campaign sign and a political sign?
Only for the intents and purposes that the campaign sign has a defined period of where you're granted extra signage. And it could be political, it could be campaign. The content of it is not up for me to decide. It just simply you can have more signage on your property during campaign season.
Okay.
But during campaign season, 30 days is not really appropriate.
No, so there's a specific standard in the ordinance if you want to take a look at it. Let's pull it up here. So it's in your packets before you, right below that section that I just shared with you.
Politicians or political campaigns in Saline have generally followed that rule, putting signs up about 30 days before the election, generally speaking, not exclusively.
But is that the condition 30 days prior?
I have to pull, it's more like 60 days because
Yeah.
it's a state
Yeah.
aspect too. We adopted it almost identical to what neighboring communities have on that because the belief is allowing more signs rather than larger signs is definitely one of the easier ways to navigate that specific thing without risking some sort of frivolous lawsuit essentially, which is, I think, our primary concern when you're regulating speech. So the specific campaign language is D of the temporary sign section under 5. Has standards for temporary signs. In recognition that there is need for an additional expression of speech prior to a scheduled election, the following applies for a period of 60 days prior and 5 days after a local, state, or national election day. The maximum allowable area of non-residential temporary signs shall increase to 64 square feet per parcels in all districts. The maximum area of an individual sign remains stated as the table above during this period.
So that's for a campaign sign. Just for the record, a political sign.
So it doesn't specifically state a campaign sign. It's that we are just allowing more signage during that period. We're not stating what it can or can't be. It could be political, it could be for a PAC, it could be for a campaign. And in actuality, it could probably be for a non-political purpose altogether. It could be additional commercial speech that.
But a political sign not related to a campaign could be up for a more protracted period of time.
Yes, I apologize, yes. And right, and we're not telling them they have to move any specific sign. We're saying they have to reduce the total square footage of signage that they're displaying, which once again gets us totally out of the content game and really into, you can keep whatever else you want up, but it can only be this, so.
A campaign refers to a ballot proposal too?
So any local, state, or national election day.
Election stuff,
And for a real estate sign?
So for a real estate sign, let's just pull that here too. When all or portion of a building is being listed for land, this is item F in that same section, is listed for lease, or when all of our portion of a building or land is listed for sale, the maximum display time of freestanding temporary signs for all uses and temporary signs mounted on buildings for all uses except residential uses shall be the duration of the building unit or land is listed for lease or sale. The sign shall not exceed 32 square feet per side, which is the same standard. It's for the duration the building is for sale.
Okay.
The building,
There's no
land,
time
or
limit.
lease. No, there's no time limit on it specifically.
Yes.
So we're allowing a real estate sign up to 32 square feet?
Yes, and that matches, that's in line with the existing temporary sign standards. We'd still adjust those either way.
Because my issue's been those B signs that are on the industrial park, and actually that one that's always been next to Dairy Queen, which seems huge.
Okay, I can
So,
take a look at it.
I mean, I could even cut that in half and be satisfied with it. I know they're trying to sell the land, but they don't need a billboard to do it.
Okay, so 16 square feet is, I guess we can develop a consensus on this. It's a difficult thing
That's a
to,
4x4 sign versus a piece of plywood. It's half a plywood sign.
Technically, they're trying to lease the property.
The other issues I had, when you were mentioning the banners, of course, but I also have concerns about, and we just saw that happen this past weekend, a large 2 or 3 by 8 banner sign that's stuck onto 2 fence posts. Christine's had one of them, but it's also the AT&T banner that's up every other month. I know we're going to address that at timing, but what type of banner signs are we going to allow? Because you'll see them all the time. There'll be big ones that are hanging on the building. There's the one down right now. There's a banner sign that's for the game shop. It's not actually a real sign. It's just a banner. And I don't know, what do we have in terms of allowing those to be and the size and all that?
right, so there's nothing that prohibits RU Game essentially from having a banner. If it pleased you to know, they have submitted a formal sign permit they have their own reasons for needing an actual sign too, but we don't have any strict prohibition of banners provided that it meets the definition of the code. The way to negate the feather banners, the flag banners, whatever you want to call them, but it's a vertical thing. I think we've all seen them and it kind of looks like a feather, is the height restriction. So our proposed height is no more than 6 feet, and those things are usually 8 to 10 feet, 8 to 12 feet in height. So that would negate it likely. However, there are other means of our ability to stop that essentially.
Well, That's the issue. How, do you define that AT&T as a banner sign? Because it's hanging between two posts.
Yeah, I would define it as a banner, but like, as I said, we've removed that specific word from this, but I think it could potentially be captured by other items in this ordinance as well, such as size and allowance for total property.
Okay. Because that's been the issue. We've had large signs or banners that go up, especially like temporary or going out of business signs, and they don't disappear for a while. But I don't want to see that sign continually coming up, because they've been using the same sign for 6 years, and it's looking like a mess, but it's just an annoyance and it's an eyesore. That's why I'm surprised with this one that showed up on the west side of town. That was a huge banner sign. It's like, either stick to the small political signs, or like you were just mentioning, the smaller temporary signs, which are like a political sign or whatever, versus these large banners, which I think are just an attempt to try and build a billboard without doing a billboard.
Yeah, so I guess I don't know if my laser pointer really works or not, but essentially, like I said, we can limit the size of allowed temporary signs. So if the planning commission's opinion is that these banners are obnoxiously large or too big or whatever it might be, we could absolutely require that they're scaled down. And it's not a non-conforming issue because they're inherently temporary. They have to be removed anyways.
So how do we do that at this point in time, or?
I mean, so it still has to go to city council. So if there's a recommendation to be made that we would like to reduce that or look to reduce that, and I can provide a variety of different sized alternatives to the city council, a visual demonstration too, as I did at the last meeting here, that's absolutely something we can move forward with.
Okay. And then the other question I had was regarding the issue that we just discussed. Buildings have multiple signs. So like the place on Bennett, where they had the sign on the top, they had a sign in the window, and then they had lights around the window. And then the other example is like High Society, where High Society has a sign, and then they have a giant cannabis sign in the window. Is there ability for us to limit the number of signs that you can have, similar to what we're talking about with the temps? You have one large identification sign and that's it?
My particular fear with that is that it kind of ends up in a quagmire of what is a sign and like what are they using as incidental signs and what are we fully counting? And I think that is a perilous way to get into that, is trying to regulate the total number of signs or the combination of signs that a property can have. There are ways that we could potentially do it, but that would require more legal review, because I don't feel comfortable writing a regulation that does that on my own, essentially.
Because I mean, what was weird is when you see that giant cannabis sign underneath Society, that's a neon sign, that just seems like it's advertising the product, not necessarily identifying the business that's there. And that gets into that whole issue of advertising. The other one is when you mentioned 25% of a window, is it 25% of the pane or 25% of all their window coverage? Because Wendy's has got a sign blocking every single window.
So we've been interpreting it as total window coverage, because at least when I got here, that's seemingly how it was enforced, that it was 25% of the total window coverage. But we could negate it down to 25% of any individual pane. That is acceptable.
I think that's my recommendation, is that we go that route, because you're seeing a lot of that, especially with the situation with the new restaurant putting up all their beer signs, advertising beer, not necessarily business.
Yeah, but the businesses need to advertise, tell us what their product is. There's nothing, I don't think it's repulsive to have.
They're billboards, when you look at the restaurant, the New Mexican restaurant, I went down there, it had 6 signs in each one of their windows, full-size signs advertising Corona, I don't think it was Bud Light, foods, other stuff, and it's like, you can advertise some, but not every single window needs to be its own billboard, and that's kind of always been a concern, and it's supposed to have been a safety issue. There was always an issue with being able to look into a window from a perspective of safety, and not necessarily blocking them all out.
I'm sorry. Madam Chair, let me acknowledge receipt of the memos, and then we can dive into the discussion and see if we can get consensus for a subsequent motion.
Okay.
So I'll move to acknowledge receipt of the 3 memos dated July 19th, June 9th, and April 20th.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries. All right, let's continue on with our questions. I mean, we have 2 options for temporary signs that Mr. Harrington brought up and, is up for discussion. We're having a window discussion I don't know where to point us, but let's start with temporary signages. There were 2, on-site, off-site, and kind of combining them. What's the flavors right now to discuss? Having on-site and off-site regulations, combining them? Does anybody have a strong preference either way?
I mean, the issue with the off-site one is because we have concerns of not being able to advertise for our basically our organization and nonprofits and all of that. So we have to treat them no differently than we would treat commercial.
That's correct.
In this approach. So when would you actually enforce off-site if we can't make a distinction between any of those?
Well, so if you don't make a distinction between off-site and on-site, and you went with the second option, I would just enforce the text of this code, which says 4. It's a much easier thing for me to enforce with all practicality and honesty, because it's 4 signs. It's pretty obvious if you have more than 4 signs. And ultimately, the goal of this temporary sign overhaul, too, is to make it really the responsibility of whoever owns the property to manage their own signage rather than the Community Development Department, because that's how it's been for the last 30 years, where we're stickering temporary signs for people that have applied for them. And it's a colossal waste of our time as a city to be monitoring signage for somebody else. So
And this is clearly only for temporaries. There's no way we do not allow an off-site permanent sign, correct? That advertises an off-site.
there are very specific, it's all but impossible, yes.
Okay. I just want to make sure that we had that one covered. Okay. Whichever one I think is the easiest, is enforceable and one that addresses the concerns, since now we're limiting it to 4 from my perspective, I think I want to make sure it's the easiest way to enforce it.
Perfect. All right, and then the follow-up question I would have is, do we like 4 as a number, yes or no? And then, do we like the size allowance of 16 or 32 square feet, or do we want to remove those or limit them?
And this goes with the professional business district, so it would be the 16 feet. If it's on-site, off-site, doesn't matter, sign size?
Correct.
As it's written, okay.
I'd have those sizes, 8 and 16, not 16 and 32.
Okay, and then for the maximum total, so if you went 8 and 16, they could then have a 16-foot sign that's either double-sided, or they could have 2 16-foot square foot signs. Is that in line with what our expectation is?
I think that's adequate.
16.
Yeah, that's fine. And 4, I think, is a good number, because we usually have 3 or 4 events going on a weekend, so that should allow enough for it, especially like on the bank uptown. Or DQ.
Okay.
So option 2 is where we're leaning towards 4 signs and having the size that's listed in the table that's,
Proposed, yes.
okay.
And front and back counts as 2.
Yes, so yeah, so there's in this highlighted section, there's the maximum area in square foot per sign. So you could have a face could be 16 square, in this, let's go to the one we proposed, it could be 8 feet. But if it's a 2-sided sign, then the total square footage is then 16 square feet. So even though the structure itself is only technically 8 square feet, because the message is on both sides, it would be 16 in totality, and then it would be capped on the PB district.
Excellent. Additional discussion about this? All right. That was number 1. Number 2 we talked about, so that's where we're going. Prohibiting non-real estate temporary signs on undeveloped and vacant lots. Is that something that we have strong preference on? How would we like to steer this discussion?
I think the limiting of the signs that you just did would more or less accomplish that. It's not a very common thing, but if you were trying to allow, that was more if you stayed with the first option,
Okay.
I would say. But if there's particular feelings one way or the other, we can still.
The time allotted for it, 30 days on, 30 days off? Is that part of this temporary option number 2, or that's what we're also discussing as well?
Originally it was 30 days, 60 days off.
Yes, I'm sorry. It's 30 days before another temporary. Yeah, it was originally 30-60, and then as a body, you switched to 30-30. My phone.
So how are we going to regulate this? If someone puts a sign up on a vacant lot, is it the lot owner's responsibility?
Yes. That's the whole point, is that we're going to inform the lot owner that someone has placed speech on your property.
Oh, so we're going to be responsible for informing the lot owner
Yes, rather than permitting it on their behalf, which is unfortunately the practice of the city prior to this. So, yeah, so I would be sending a courtesy notice saying, hey, you're oversigned, you need to figure that out. Otherwise, we could just move to citations at that point. But I'm making it the CVS's issue essentially to deal with their own lot on Dairy Queen rather than my job to monitor on their behalf and then report back to them, what's there, what's been damaged or whatever, what's been approved for them to have there.
Additional discussion?
Was there something else?
So in that one, the clause that's added in this is the cumulative display time for any combination of temporary signs on the same property shall not exceed 30 days with any consecutive 60-day period. Again, meaning if you have 1, 2, 3 signs out, then you can't pull them off and then put one down for the next 30-day period. It's 30 days of that 4-sign combination and then 30 days off.
I think you've done a good job on this. Hopefully we've covered it. My only concern is the issue with banners, but if you believe there's a way to address those banners and.
I think the size recommendation you just made will do quite a bit. And I think that this is something we're going to be messaging on. I'm going to have Danica assist me with making some fun infographics for business owners about, what it needs to be capped at, what an example of a 8-square-foot sign and a 16-square-foot sign are, so.
So let me give you, actually, now you mentioned, give you an example. Bush's Plaza down there. Now we've allowed up to 4 temporary signs, you said?
For the entire plaza. So it's Bush's and AT&T, it's on their shopping center essentially, because that is a single shopping center for them to figure out how they're going to manage that process.
So Bush's could have that banner, Bush's could have their banner, AT&T could have their banner, Bush's could have their banner. What is they always have a real estate sign up that is permanently up leasing.
So I think the banners themselves would probably be over the size allotment. So I think that would be captured by that, and then it's up to the shopping center to choose who gets to display what when, and not our problem at that point.
But the real estate sign would be considered a temporary sign?
The real estate sign, like I said, it goes up for the length of the property or the unit being under lease, so.
So the example I can think of is like, they'll have that lease open for a year on the building, so that sign could be up for a year?
Yes.
Okay. And there's nothing that would say you have to take it down at some period of time?
No, I think one of the things we.
All in the disrepair.
Right, and I think one of the things that we ought to do as a department is better enforce the specific blight standards for decrepit and decayed retail sign or real estate signs. Because I agree, there's examples on Sage Court too, prior to those properties being sold, where the signs were in rather bad condition.
Okay. Is there a motion on the table to recommend to Saline City Council to adopt, not adopt, or postpone the new ordinance number 857?
I'll make a motion to adopt.
Before I can interrupt, the window thing was the last one. Is it 25% of the total area or 25% of a window pane? And I'm totally indifferent one way or the other. I think most businesses will learn to adjust with whatever the regulation ends up being.
I would do total, because you might have different size windows.
And I do know that some property owners do the whole screening on some of them where you can
Yes.
see through on one side because it's another effective advertisement for them. Like I said, I don't think I don't see a public safety issue in it necessarily, provided that other windows are not exposed or exposed on the building, so. So we can leave that as is, and there's no need to make a recommendation on that end.
Perfect. All right. Motion to recommend to Saline City Council to adopt, not adopt, or postpone. Number 857.
I'll move to recommend to adopt with the adjustments that we just talked about.
So with you could just say option number 2, because I think that's clear enough from what we talked about. And then with the sizes for temporary signs, cut in half, or switch to 8 and 16 feet.
I'll second.
Any additional discussion? Nope. All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? Motion passes. Ben had wanted to add a discussion item? No.
Yeah, absolutely. If I can. So with these, because both ADUs and this came back, I submitted to you all the back memos I had also written for additional context. I now realize, looking through it on Minutes on Demand, which is what you all received, that it had to be incredibly confusing. So would you prefer that we submit to you back memos, or would you prefer that I just referred that they exist in the report and give you the meeting that it was presented at so that you could go and look at that if you so wished, because I don't want to add additional memos that are conflating or confusing about the opinion, because I think that's likely what happened, so.
Could you link it like Saline, like
Yes.
council does? If it's linked on the minutes on demand, I would prefer that because I'm not going to go back and look for it, I'm telling you.
Okay, so
Link it.
I can literally just add at the bottom a hyperlink to the meeting minutes on demand, and then you'll be able to access
It's
it.
easy. Yeah.
Perfect. That makes my life a lot easier too, so I don't have to re-add it, and Danica's life a lot easier too.
Yeah, and as long as it's had, those papers, when it's highlighted, we'll go back and look at it.
I like the highlighting too, so that we know to go back and look for it.
Perfect.
All right, is there a motion on the table to excuse the absence of L. Cole?
Second.
Okay, Mr. Beardsley, all those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? L's absence is excused. Is there a motion on the table to adjourn at 8:38? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries. Have a great night.
Are we signing?
Please, yeah, please sign the